Carte Identity, 62 Days of Prayer, Anti-Asian Racism. Today on The Pursuit, Ray Chang. Welcome to The Pursuit, unfiltered conversations with faith leaders about their journey to pursue God. I'm your host, Richard Lee, and today my guest is Ray Chang. Ray is a pastor, writer, campus minister at Wheaton College, and president of the AACC, the Asian American Christian Collaborative. You may have heard him speaking or read his writing on the issues of race, culture, and faith. He's lived, worked, traveled to over 50 countries throughout the world, and he brings all of that diversity of experience into what he does and how he leads. But Ray says that one of the most formative times in his life was when he spent 62 days in prayer. So Ray, actually the first time I met you, I hadn't realized actually that I read something you wrote years ago when you wrote an open letter to John Piper about Lecrae.
No, yeah, it was a few years ago. It's something that I wrote in response to Lecrae being on a Truth Table podcast, saying that he was divorcing himself from white evangelicalism.
Right.
Yeah, and then I wrote the piece. It got a lot of traction. I got responses from not only all across the country, but even across the world.
Wow.
Talking about how it ministered to so many people, giving them language for the things that they were experiencing.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was necessarily saying anything new, but I think I was saying it in a way that fit the time, fit the experiences, fit the moment.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for the way that God used that piece.
Yeah. So you and Piper are cool now?
Yeah, no, we saw each other at a conference, and then he was at Wheaton College with his wife, and we spent a couple hours just kind of sitting together talking about ministry and life. And then his son, Barnabas, who went to school with me, but we didn't know each other at the time.
Mm-hmm.
We connected about the letter as well, and he said he appreciated the tone and the content of it, and so. I mean, my hope is that the letter ultimately serves the church, especially the evangelical church, so that we can be more faithful in our witness of Christ, and to help draw more unity and solidarity amongst and across the different racial lines and groups, and hopefully that we can de-racialize by tending to the needs of those in our midst.
So tell me about your experience growing up. Were you born here in America?
Yeah, I was born in Chicago, lived in both the North Shore suburbs, so a predominantly Jewish area, and then in the South Side where it was predominantly Black and Hispanic. Well, I mean, for me, it's where I grew up is a pretty complicated one, because I grew up in both the North Side and the South Side of Chicago.
Yeah.
I lived all over the Chicagoland, and then in junior high, right after junior high was over, I moved to Korea, then Hawaii, then to California, and then by that time I was I'd gone to I'm going to 5 different high schools in 4 different kind of parts of the world.
5 high schools.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Because I moved around so much. My parents were business people, and so they moved us around quite a bit. So I lived in Guatemala for 1 year by myself, but then all these other places, my parents kept moving us around until they landed in California, where they are today.
So you grew up in all these different places and all these different countries and all these different cultures. How did that affect your idea of self-identity growing up?
That's a great question. It's hard, right? Because my parents were immigrants. They migrated here from Korea. My dad is a first gen. My mom is a 1.5 gen, which basically means she came early enough for her to kind of get accustomed and acculturated to the United States, whereas my dad came in his kind of mid-20s. But for me, because they worked like 14-hour days, right? In order to kind of get established in the United States, they took big risks, started restaurants, and then and were working all the time. And so I really didn't have adult conversation partners. My conversation partners were either my sister, the kids at school, or my teachers, who were majority white, right? I mean, like I went to a majority white school for the majority of my life growing up. And I remember there were only like 3 or 5 kind of Asians. And so we didn't have many conversations around what it meant to be Asian. All I remember was feeling like we had a certain pride about being Asian, there's a word in Korean called Chang, where we just kind of had this affinity to each other.
Uh-huh.
But then we were also like kind of distancing ourselves from one another at the same time.
Right.
Right. So it's like you don't want to be lumped in together with all the Asians because you know that, and you don't even know this consciously. You kind of know it subconsciously that it's going to lead to ridicule.
Right.
And so you kind of do the head nod, or you kind of like acknowledge each other. But then you don't really want to be seen with each other. And I didn't really recognize that or know that, and I didn't have anyone to talk about it with. And so
Yeah.
my identity was really difficult to kind of navigate. And the individual identity can't be separated from a collective identity,
Mm-hmm.
especially in a racialized society.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really know what it meant to be Asian American until like I was reading scholarship on what it meant to be Asian American, and that was like well into my 20s.
I was gonna say that's not high school. Come on.
No, no, no. But I was probably confused about what it meant to be Asian American all the way until my 20s.
Yeah.
Right. Because I knew certain things. And a lot of times the things that I kind of adopted were like the stereotypical things or the things that you saw on, movies or Korean dramas. And I even lived in Korea for a couple of years. And so there was a part of like the Korean culture that was within me. But I always kind of had them in two separate bins within my own
Yeah.
person. Right. So I had the Korean side, then the American side, but I realized that my Korean American side had no category to fit within.
Yeah, it's almost like an a la carte identity.
Hmm.
Like in whatever context you find yourself, whichever identity you feel like is most advantageous for you to align yourself with. Like I'm American, or I'm Korean, or I'm Asian, or I'm white, like that sort of a thing, like try to assimilate into whatever is sort of the path of most acceptance.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think most people are just looking for belonging, right?
Right.
But they're looking for a belonging where they can fully show up, where they don't have to hide parts of themselves that God has kind of wired them with or deposited into them. And we see in the book of Revelation that it's every tribe, nation, tongue, and people group come together, not just one tribe, one tongue, one people group, and one nation.
Right.
And yet, because of the way that race works, it almost feels like we have to become like the dominant racial culture in order to fit within the kingdom of God. And I think that kind of grieves the heart of God.
So when you went to college, where did you go?
So I went to a junior college for 2 years because I had moved around so much. In high school, I was just like, I don't want to do any more school. I don't want to go through another transition. It was so difficult that I didn't want to go through another one.
Yeah.
But then my friends were like, you should at least go to take some classes, and so I just kind of went to a junior college full time and felt like, oh, schooling actually fits with kind of what I'm interested in. I like learning. I like to study.
Oh, you didn't want to go to college at all?
I didn't want to go to college at that point. I was so tired of again moving from one place to another
Yeah.
5 times in 4 years was
Yeah.
a lot.
Mm.
I mean, it was exhausting. And so you have to start. It's not just like you're moving locations by packing up your things and going to another place. You're also like making new friends. You're also trying to like reinvent yourself. You're trying to figure out, okay, who did I like
Yeah.
being in the last place, and then who do I want to continue being from the last place, and then who do I want to be, moving forward. And a lot of that, without me knowing, actually was shaped by how I was racialized, right? How I was treated simply because of my race and ethnicity. And
Wow.
so I remember constantly like adjusting myself to fit in when I was in high school, hiding more of my Korean Americanness when I was going into more predominantly white spaces, and then becoming more Korean American when I was going to more kind of diverse and multi-ethnic spaces.
Wow. That's a lot to bear as a teenager.
I think so too. I mean, but the hard thing is I had no one to talk about it with, so I had to do some like retroactive processing in order to understand what my own experiences were.
So you take 2 years at junior college, and then what?
And then I transferred to Wheaton, and then that's where I finished my undergraduate degree. And then I worked at a bunch of different places afterwards. And I currently work at Wheaton in the chaplain's office as a campus minister.
Mhm.
But then I did the Peace Corps after in Panama. I worked for a couple of nonprofits. One was what was dealing with Korean American issues. I worked for a real estate technology startup. Moved back to Korea to try some different things, and then ended up back in LA where I felt like for about 2 months I was just called to pray, and so it was 62 days of prayer, and I was just kind of living in one of my parents' rooms for 62 days in my mid 20s. Spent some time praying, and it was then that a lot of heart work was done by God to get me more in line with Him, and I felt like there was a kind of a revisiting of kind of earlier conversations I had with God, commitments I made to God, callings that I sensed from God to pursue a form of vocational ministry. And so that's when I chose to go to seminary at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and then have been on that track and been in ministry ever since.
Yeah. So what prompted the 60-day, 62-day prayer time?
Yeah, so I was living in Korea at the time, and kind of feeling lost vocationally. And so I was pursuing work in investment banking in Korea because my cousin was an investment banker out there, and said I should come out and explore the field, since he thought that I would be pretty good at it.
Mm,
And so that's when I moved out there. But for me, it just didn't feel like that was where God was calling me into. And I think a part of that was because I was looking for security in my career, in my status, in things that were much more worldly than God would want me to be pursuing.
right.
And so I think it was for that particular season, it was much more around my heart than what I was actually doing.
Yeah.
And I say, okay, you know what? I got to go back to the States, and I got to kind of press the reset button. And fortunately, like my parents had a house that was big enough for me to be able to live with them and all this other stuff,
Right.
and was able to feed me and house me. And that's when I started. I said, God, for 62 days, I'm going to pray, and I'm asking you for clarity. And I just remember, like, it was such a difficult time praying. I had such a hard time praying for even 5 minutes a day for probably like
Yeah.
2 weeks straight. But I said, I'm going to get on my knees and just pray.
Yeah.
But then after I kept at it for about 2 weeks, my prayers started flowing a little more and a little more, to the point that at the end of my like 60 days, I was praying like 4 or 5 hours a day.
Man. Wow.
It was probably the richest and most intimate time of fellowship I had with God in all of my life.
Some of the things that I'm hearing in your story is that, you moved around a lot. And then when you graduated to college, you went into a bunch of different industries. And so there's a lot of hopping around and a lot of choosing new paths, or new paths choosing you. And people that know you and people that see you, like, you have a pretty happy disposition. But I think that there's a sense in which I think a lot of people that went through so much of the movement and tumult that you went through growing up, and even in like your early on in your career, that they'd be angry, they'd be bitter, they'd be miserable, they'd be, hard to be around. But you're like a delightful personality, and you have this delightful disposition. Like, how did that all work?
I have no idea. Because I think there is a part of it that, like psychologists would say that I dissociate. And so there's a part of me that I still feel like I'm excavating, like the wounds that I haven't really like dug into.
Yeah.
And I think I do think that there's a part of the happiness, or the or as you call it, the delightfulness, is genuine. I think it's genuine to who I am.
Sure.
I remember when I was a kid, like I just love to love life. I
Mm,
loved people. I loved kind of all that was around. I was fascinated by things. I was very curious as a kid, and I was what Koreans would call a 장난꾸러기, right? What do you call it? A rascal, I think is what you would call it in English. But on the other hand, I do think that there is a part of it where I just kind of stuffed down the pain
mm,
and stuffed down the wounds, so I don't have to confront it.
mm.
So that I could just be a positive guy. So I could just be a happy guy. So I could just be kind of like present my joyfulness in front of other people,
Yeah.
instead of presenting the sorrow. Right. I mean, like, I totally understand that my parents had to make tremendous sacrifices in order to provide for us, right? Working 14 to 16 hours a day, not being able to pick us up on time because
Right.
the restaurant got busy exactly when they were supposed to come pick us up. Not being able to go on family vacations because Chinese restaurants and Asian restaurants. We're Korean, but we own Chinese restaurant.
Mm.
We owned a Chinese restaurant because people didn't know what Korean food really was at the time, right?
Right, right.
And my parents were just trying to survive. They were just trying to make the sacrifices that they needed to make, and they felt like we're kind of being asked of them in order to provide opportunities for my sister and I to succeed later in the future.
Yeah.
But it does come at a cost. These sacrifices, they came at a significant cost, where I think there's probably emotional wounds that still need to be tended to. I'm probably stunted in some way emotionally that and I think there's a reason why it becomes so much harder for me, I think, to talk about some difficult things that pertain to me,
Mm.
right? Which is why I'm really good at talking about other people and helping other people,
Right.
talking about things external to myself, but not good at talking about things internal to myself because it just becomes like too scary or
Right.
too confusing or too painful to even navigate. Which is why I'm so glad that that there are counselors out there and therapists
Yeah.
who help you navigate through this stuff. Because part of that comes from family wounds. Other parts come from generational issues. Other parts come from your own personal experiences. But other things come from the fact that racialization has taken a toll on a lot of communities of color, and we don't even know what that toll fully is. And so when we experience forms of racism, those things actually hurt us, and they're not just like stickers that you can just take off of yourself. You actually have to work through them, get the gospel's healing message into them, but then also understand what's led to those things in your own life.
So you've told us a little bit about the journey that you've had physically, like moving around a lot, and vocationally. What was your journey spiritually?
Yeah, so I think I haven't met anyone else that has a similar kind of faith ancestry, if you want to call it that. So my mom and my dad, I think sixth and seventh generation Christian, or I'm a sixth and seventh generation. They're fifth and sixth generation Christian.
Wow.
That's pretty uncommon within kind of within Korean history to see, especially Korean American history.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's an element that we have a rich spiritual heritage. But as I always tell my students, like you also have to take ownership over your own faith at some point, and it's
Hmm.
usually in college, or when you first leave the house and you become quote unquote more independent. I think for me, I remember when I was probably like 7 years old, 7, 8, or 9. My parents owned a deli in Evanston. So, my parents had multiple restaurants, and one was a deli in Evanston, not too far from Northwestern University.
Uh-huh.
And every weekend I would go in with them to the deli.
Uh-huh.
But on our way there, I remember my mom was listening to a Christian radio station, and there was this kind of like this old school choral hymn being sung. I don't remember what the song was, but I just remember that it just touched me so deeply.
Yeah.
And so I had known church all my life, but this was the first time I felt like the Holy Spirit was ministering to me directly.
Wow.
And I just remember crying for about 2 hours, to the point that my mom couldn't open the store. Like, she was like, I have a kid that's out of control because he's bawling. I had snot
Wow.
flying all over the place. Like tears were just streaming down. It was this like peaceful crying. It was almost this like release saying,
Mm.
where I felt like God was saying, I see you, I know you, I love you, I care about you, I'm with you.
Man, how old were you at this point?
Probably 7 or 9 years old.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
But I just remember, like, again, I think, on top of my like kind of my rascal disposition, I
Yeah.
also had a very tender heart towards God, and a kind of sensitive disposition.
Delightful disposition.
A delightful disposition, but like like a tender disposition towards like people that are hurting, right? Because
Yeah.
I think subconsciously I knew how lonely I felt, growing up, especially as my parents couldn't be there at home with me all the time.
Yeah.
And then I had followed the kind of the typical journey for as many Korean American Christians kind of have followed, where you obey through behavior, but your heart doesn't necessarily follow your behaviors.
Yeah.
And then like at some point, I just was like, I was always known, like since junior high and high school in various places, like my friends would call me Pastor Ray.
Really?
Yeah, and I think most of that was because I was much more legalistic and rule oriented. Hey, do this, live like this, and I didn't mind telling people how they should live
Right.
in obedience to God. But I also think that people knew that I genuinely cared about them, and I genuinely, cared about
Yeah.
what God cared about. And so even in my my pharisaical kind of disposition, I think people had a sense that I love God, I love them, and I wanted what was best for them, even though a part of that was probably driven by some weird, whacked out theology
Right.
that wasn't fully developed. And so, like in junior high and high school, I people would regularly call me that, and then I would try to move away from the whole notion of pursuing ministry. And so, in college, I started liking the idea of becoming the elder at a church who didn't have any financial worries, who didn't have any stress in their life,
Right.
who could generously give,
Right.
not have to worry about a thing, and then provide for the youth kids when they needed the extra fundraising boost. Help supply the church with a building.
Oh, you really had this thought out.
I had it thought out when this was like in college, and I was like, I want to be the rich
Yeah.
elder that can just be generous towards
Yeah.
everyone and then never experience hardship for myself.
Right. Right.
Right? Because I had seen what my parents had gone through.
Yeah.
I had seen what other family friends had gone through, and I liked the idea of not stressing out about money. And so that's when I started kind of veering away from what I kind of felt like was a stronger commitment to vocational ministry
Hmm.
to pursue things in the business or in the non kind of quote unquote vocational ministry realm. And that kind of led me down a winding path where, I was doing a whole bunch of different jobs at different places. But at every point, I felt like God was saying, whenever I did another job, I said, like, God was telling me, this is not it for you.
Yeah.
This is not it for you. This is not it for you. This is not it for you. This is not what I have for you. But I'm going to let you learn through all of this and gain what you need to gain in order for me to be able to redeem all of your experiences in the future. Yeah, and so I think at some point, like when I pursued seminary and then started going, at some point I felt like God was saying, no, this is the reset. And it was those 62 days of prayer where God was kind of recalling me
Wow.
back to pursue kind of the commitment that I had made to Him, the calling that I felt from Him. And I'm not saying that if you made a commitment to God when you were younger and you're not fulfilling that God is somehow gonna like drag you back.
Yeah.
He's gracious. He's bigger than us. He knows where our hearts are. He knows where
Hmm.
where we are in our own journeys, in our faith journeys with Him. But at the same time, I felt like for me there was a deeper calling that God was calling me into for quite some time, and I was avoiding it. And those 62 days were very clarifying for me.
So you go into vocational ministry, and that's as a pastor at first?
Yeah, so I mean, I did youth ministry, and in my early 20s, on top of other things that I was doing,
Okay.
and so that was a part-time role in California. And then I worked at a church on the pastoral staff, and then I got a job at Wheaton, where I'm currently serving as like a campus minister.
Tell us about your role at Wheaton.
So I oversee the discipleship efforts at the college, and so I have the privilege of being able to basically oversee a small group ministry that has probably between a third to half of the campus participating in it. But I oversee three small group ministries, so it's kind of like I'm like a community life pastor.
Okay.
But then I also preach in chapel, do a lot of pastoral counseling and
Sure.
have a lot of pastoral conversations. And then I'll serve institutional kind of task forces like the evangelism task force and the diversity task force.
Ray, recently, I think increasingly, your voice has really been a voice for the Asian American community that has given articulation and words to some of the pain that we have faced in this society in history, but also even just most recently through this COVID crisis with the anti-Asian racism that has been going on. How have you sort of become that voice, and how prepared do you feel to be that voice?
Well, I don't know if I'm prepared to be that voice, but I think and I don't think I'm the only voice,
Of course, right.
right? And I hope I'm not the only voice. I know other people that are speaking up on issues that are really near and dear to the heart of God. But I think, like I look back at my own life and my own history, and since I was little, I would always care and have a kind of like a special disposition towards those who are marginalized or
Mm,
overlooked or on the outside or were kind of excluded or kind of pushed away. to the point that I think even when I was growing up, my mom would always tell me that if we ever encountered someone that looked like they were in need, maybe like a homeless person, I would just empty out my pockets and give them whatever I had. Right. And so I don't know where that came from. I think it was just like a kind of a disposition of generosity that God gave to me when I was a little kid, especially for those who were in kind of like greater need. And I think that kind of that lens of looking to those who are excluded, looking to those who are marginalized, looking to those who are kind of cast out or pushed out or overlooked has kind of been a theme in my own life, in part because of my own experiences of having to move so many times and being the outsider that wants to go in, right? It takes a lot of energy to like make friends and to connect with people and to know that you're and especially when you're younger, when you're on the outside trying to work your way in, that there are memories that groups of friends have shared together that you haven't, and that you're not necessarily the one that's preferred among the whole group when people are getting together and there's four spaces in a car and you might be the fifth person or the sixth person, right? And so, because of those experiences in my own life,
Yeah.
I think that disposition has always kind of been within me. But in terms of like how I moved into the issues
Yeah.
of kind of addressing race from a Christian perspective, I think it was because I lived in so many different places, right? I lived in
Yeah.
Korea, Hawaii, California, Guatemala, Panama, Spain, China.
Right.
And one of the things I started regularly hearing, whether it was because I was like speaking at different places or reconnecting with friends from different places or visiting and traveling, was this consistent theme around how Asian Americans experienced usually predominantly white spaces.
Yeah.
And it was consistent with my own experience, right? Like I grew up in a variety of different settings. I grew up in all these different places. I lived all over the world. And I think personally for me, the places that were hardest for me to feel like I was a full member, whatever community, were in white evangelical spaces. And I don't think that anyone intends to make it like this, right? There's no intention to like make this a more exclusionary space.
Right. It's not malicious.
No, it's never malicious, right? It's like, I think everyone has the intention to like make this a more inclusive space.
Sure.
But I think there are key dispositions, key ways of thinking about the world, key ways of understanding power and structures and even culture and how culture is shaped and made that lead to a sense of not belonging and a sense of exclusion that's felt by people of color broadly and more specific and specifically because we're Asian American, we're Korean American, right? And a lot of times it's like people don't automatically recognize it when they're young. Like I couldn't name it, I couldn't recognize it. I just felt like I was the problem and I needed to do a better job of fitting in. I needed to do more work in changing myself in order to belong. But what I realized was that the environment was not an inclusive environment. The environment was not a welcoming environment.
Right.
Because of the dispositions that people held that, again, weren't necessarily tied to intent, but more closely to worldviews that were tied to a racialized whiteness more than a gospel theology.
I think one of the challenges of being a voice for a wide group of people, is trying to be able to be a good representative of people that have different experiences in different contexts and be able to articulate them and own their perspective well. And when I think about your upbringing, I think about all the different contexts that you grew up in. You spent time in Korea and in Hawaii and all around the world, and you've seen and experienced these different contexts. And so in some ways, I feel like you had an accelerated exposure to such a wide array of experiences that helps prepare you for this moment to be a voice that can articulate people's own cathartic and personal experiences from their own perspective and experiences. Because in some ways, like, you've related to them all in some way or another, in some microscopic way. For a period of time, you felt the same way.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of my pastor's heart, right? I think,
Right.
pastors have to care about the people in their in their care. They have to put themselves in people's shoes. We can't just say, hey, climb up the stairs to where I am, right? And wherever that might be,
right?
Wherever we think that God calls them to be, but we have to go to where they are. And I think that's kind of the primary disposition that's been kind of adopted as I experience the kind of outsiderness. Like, I've always wanted people to just come to where I am and sit with me,
right,
and just be with me. And I and in a lot of these different spaces, especially in what I would call white evangelical spaces, it was always, if you don't come to where I am, then you don't, like, you don't really have a place here. You don't have a place
right,
not at the table. You don't have a place not at the room.
right.
I do think that there's an element in which I have had to learn, how to speak in multiple kind of
Yeah,
languages per se, like to navigate the different landscapes. Like,
sure.
I consider myself an evangelical. I love scripture.
Yeah,
I love I love what God calls us to. I love the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it's because of that love that I feel like a part of the work and energy that I spend doing is in educating and discipling people who are part of the dominant white culture and society, especially the dominant white church, to understand that these are very real things that affect believers all across the country and potentially all around the world. And in order to be a faithful witness, we have to be willing to address these things, not ignoring them as if they don't exist.
yeah,
And then for other people of color, and I try to have like a broad array of friendships, but also my vision is always driven by the kingdom of God.
uh-huh,
And so I constantly go to the sense of this multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual community that's gathering. And so I care deeply about not only what happens with Asian Americans and Korean Americans, but also what happens with African
sure,
Americans and Native Americans and Latino Americans.
of course.
And because of my experiences, like, as a Korean, I lived in a predominantly Black neighborhood for a couple years growing up.
Uh-huh,
Of course, I didn't understand how racialization worked, right? I didn't understand that we were pitted against each other, that our communities were pitted against each other, which is why there was so much suspicion around my parents moving a business into a predominantly Black neighborhood,
right,
right? There's a
right.
whole history of that.
Sure.
And a lot of that is due to, and a lot of the tensions are due to the way that the racial structures have been set up, so that Asians and Black people and Asians and Latinos and Blacks and Latinos and every other community kind of work against each other, not work with each other.
Mm,
I lived in Guatemala, and because I lived in Guatemala, like, there's a part of me that feels like, I resonate with Chapins, right? Where Guatemalans are Chapins.
uh-huh,
And so I resonate with the Central American kind of ethos, and love the joy that comes through those communities, and have learned
uh-huh,
from that. When I lived in Panama, the same thing. I learned how to celebrate life in its most simplest ways. And, living in Hawaii, that shaped how I navigated and understood the distinctions, or the uniqueness of all of the Pacific Islander groups,
right.
and the richest of the ways that their cultures and their heritages kind of bring out, especially when it's aligned with what God is calling them to, and aligned with the faith in Jesus, how it brings out more robustly our collective faith. And so,
Yeah,
yeah, so I think that there's a part of me that feels like, because of all the different places that I've lived, I've been able to make those pieces a part of me, not in a kind of a cannibalistic way, but in an honoring way. And I think
yeah,
that, like, when we travel, we often become cannibals of culture,
mm,
right? We just consume culture,
yeah,
and we don't actually appreciate it and kind of allow ourselves to be immersed in it. We only take certain things from it in a way that benefits us, and I think we lose a lot when we do that as we travel. But
yeah,
one of the dispositions I think I've learned was to kind of immerse myself, kind of bathe in cultural expressions, especially when I meet other believers in Christ, to see how they express their faith in and through and with their culture, and how that makes my own faith all the more richer.
So now, Ray, actually, you're the president of the AACC, the Asian American Christian Collaborative. Tell us a little bit about that, and if anybody's listening that wants to, I know you guys have a statement, want to sign the statement, like why we should.
Yeah. So a little while ago, I think it's been like 2 or 3 months now, 2 months, we wrote a statement on anti-Asian racism in the time of COVID-19, as we were seeing the overt racism against Asians rise, which is basically a surfacing of attitudes, beliefs, ideas about Asian Americans that have consistently existed. But if you look at history, in moments where we are scapegoated or we are targeted, overt racism, oftentimes in the form of violence across the country, actually takes place. Which is why when we started seeing national leaders start calling it the Chinese virus, and media outlets starting to call it Kung flu, we became very concerned that this would eventually lead to violence, which it did. And as we were watching and tracking with a friend of ours, and who's also one of the advisory council members of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, Russell Jung, a professor at San Francisco State University, he recorded that over 1,000 cases were self-reported on anti-Asian racism.
Yeah, I saw that.
In like the first month of this reporting form being released. And they ranged from people being kind of yelled at, chased down the street, spit on, to families being stabbed and slashed, acid being thrown on people for taking out the trash. And we really were like, okay, Christians need to say something about this. This is an assault on the image of God, image bearers who are of Asian descent. And so what we wanted to do as Christians was to say, we want to educate, inform people out of this, so that at least the church isn't perpetuating any of the violence that we're seeing, and that the church actually has something meaningful to say on issues of anti-Asian racism, but also issues of justice that flows from the heart of God as well. And so we wrote the statement, and it surprisingly gained a lot of traction really quickly. We had a lot of Asian American Christians, leaders, and friends of the Asian American community all signed their names to so that we had over like 10,000 signatures within the first month. And then we also had a bunch of institutional signers. So we had people like Mark Laverton from Fuller, the presidents of Princeton Seminary, of Gordon Conwell, World Relief, InterVarsity. So we had a bunch of different institutional signatories, which people can go online to www.asianamericanchristiancollaborative.com and see who signed the signatures. There's even a search function where you can see if someone signed or didn't sign. And so we kind of added that as a unique feature. See if find your friends. But so our hope was that it would be used by the church and by Christians, and that it would also make a statement from a Christian perspective to the world that we have something meaningful to say about the racism that we're seeing. And the best stories that we've been hearing are stories of people from churches small and large to take these to their leadership, to share these in their small group. One church took it to their elder board, and their elder board released a whole statement in a very, very kind of homogenous area where they only have like a handful of Asian Americans that live there. But they were like, if this happens to just one person from a member of our own community, we want to be able to stop it.
Wow, that's great.
So it's a formational tool. We want to form their minds. And then we also heard a lot of people use it to kind of inform their preaching in the weeks following from churches that many people would recognize, especially if you're in the evangelical world, to churches that are relatively off the beaten path. And so we've been really grateful for the response and the way that people have used the statement.
Ray is the type of guy who sees an injustice being done to a group of people and not only speaks out against it, but also, along with others, creates an organization, writes a statement, then gets over 10,000 people to sign and share that statement. Ray's journey to where he is now took him all over the world and back, and put him in places where he had to navigate situations thoughtfully and carefully. And now he's able to use all that to help thousands and thousands of others. I will put a link to the AACC website in the show notes, and you should go and you should sign that statement while you're there. You can find Ray on Instagram @RayChang502 and Twitter @TweetRayChang. And while you're there, you can find The Pursuit @ThePursuitCast. Follow, like, leave a comment, and say hi. Now, as we go, remember you may not know where your journey ends, but you can find God all along the path. You guys didn't arm wrestle to settle it once and for all?
No, I mean, he probably would have been able to out-pray me, but I'm pretty sure I would have beat him in arm wrestling.